Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome along to the latest episode of the Khalis Podcast, a platform to share the thoughts and the works of authors and writers, academics, researchers who are passionate about preserving and furthering the Sikh experience and Punjab. So this platform, as most of you are aware, we've changed the format recently so that we're now offering the video format. But to those who are listening across the usual platforms, we are still continuing that as well. But if you want to see the podcast, you can go ahead to the Khalis House YouTube page and find us on there. So in today's episode, I'm joined by Ghuntas Kaur, who is an emerging and aspiring writer, and she's recently published, or she's about to publish, her first book with Khalis House. It's called History of the Lion Family, and it's a collection of poems. So we'll be discussing the book, some of Ghuntas' inspirations, and obviously her kind of aspirations for the book as well. So Ghuntas, first of all, thank you for joining me, and welcome to the Khalis Podcast.
Of course, I'm really happy to be here, and hopefully lots of people are able to see this and get an opportunity to see the book.
That's it, yeah. So I wanted to start, Ghuntas, by just simply asking you to maybe give a bit of background into yourself and your kind of journey into poetry and generally writing. When did all of that begin?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually raised in a Sikh Punjabi household. So I was raised with the traditional traditions that we practice, and my parents read their Gurbani and told me the basic stories, and I went to Punjabi school and learned a little bit there. But I really was not connected to my faith. It really just seemed like a thing that my parents are forcing on me. I had to be dragged to Sunday school every week. It was when I came to university and I moved from Edmonton to Toronto that I really rediscovered our faith and saw Sikhi as a lifestyle versus something that is just taught separately as a religion. And so I discovered my path. I remember just spending hours down the internet discovering our history and how complex and rich it was. And then I took a trip last year to India for 4 months to volunteer at a great, lovely organization called Binglavarda. You may have heard of it. Located typically in Amritsar, but I was working at the Sangrur branch at the time. And I saw such disparities in our community there, whether it be wealth, whether it be gender. And I just felt the need to write about that. And I had already been writing poetry to that point. But I started writing more and more about our history and what was going on in our current day world within the Sikh and Punjabi communities. At the end of it, I looked at my collection and I said, this looks like a story to tell and a story that needs to be heard. So I went through the process of publishing, reached out to you guys, and really just felt like a story that needed to be heard.
Amazing. So it sounds like it was quite an organic kind of journey, I guess, into writing. You mentioned your visit to Amritsar Sahib. There's obviously, reading the poems and obviously having had the privilege to, be the editor, there's clearly a theme or themes that emerge from the poetry. There's a lot of focus on 1984, Sikh genocide, displacement, and the ongoing kind of discrimination that we endure across the diaspora. What were the specific inspirations for choosing to write about these themes?
Yeah, for sure. So typically, most of them came from personal experiences of mine. So poems like, for example, Chandigarh is a poem in the later sections of the collection. It was an experience directly of mine when I went to Chandigarh for the first time to visit. And 2 seconds within entering, we were pulled over because we had a Punjab nameplate. And there was the Sikh symbols in our car. And the person in front of us was also pulled over for the same reason. And it was just a really harrowing moment where you sat back and realized, oh, this is how the world functions. And it's things that aren't really vocalized in our community. And so it really came through those experiences. And after that experience, to me, I started asking about it, whether it be to my grandparents, my parents, other people in our community. They got a chance to sit down with me and actually discuss their experiences, which a lot of them felt they didn't have the opportunity to do so before then. And even now, talking about the book, I get so many people to open up about their experiences, about what happened in 84, the stories that they don't tell their children or feel that they don't have the space to tell their children. And so really just trying to encourage that voice being expressed.
Yeah, and it's something I think that's felt like across the generations that live in the diaspora. Like 84 is such a pivotal moment in our Itihas, in the history of the Sikhs. So it's amazing to, to see that how it continues to be that kind of talking point, because it is very much a part of our identity. Even though we live outside of Punjab, and most of the people listening in to this podcast or watching now, I know that most of the audience is based outside of Punjab. But again, I think pretty much every single guest that I've had on over the past 3 years, we've touched upon 84 or a related topic. So it continues to really kind of influence the way in which we live as Sikhs. Given the themes that you kind of touch upon, in the book, how do you feel the Sikh and Punjabi diaspora, and maybe even other diasporic communities who have kind of endured, displacement and genocide, how do you envisage they will connect with your poetry?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of minority communities relate to the fact of not being heard, right? And that's a really continuing theme. And it's crazy to me that I didn't know that 84 was a genocide that occurred to our community until I started researching by myself. It wasn't something that was spoken about very often. And we get taught a lot in the schools about the Holocaust and things that happened to Native Americans here in Canada and America, but not a lot about our own history. And so learning more about that, even considering current ongoing events with Palestine, Israel, it's really important to understand that minority communities need to be heard.
Right. Yeah. And I guess there's an opportunity within that, because you've got that kind of artistic license to portray, a scene or an experience through poetry. It then opens up kind of the wider conversations that can be had, which perhaps are based more on, the facts of the situation or the histories of, the trauma or generally even what actually took place at the time. So I think it's a kind of a beautiful way to open up other conversations, and these conversations can be had with not just within the Sikh community, they can be had in other spaces as well. But I agree with you. I think a lot of it, like even when I was growing up, there wasn't much kind of known about 84 other than perhaps what you would find from the mainstream media. There's a handful of books written, but again, the narratives within those were obviously very much skewed from the state's perspective. And I think over the past maybe 10, 15, 20 years, we've seen, and mainly from the diaspora, I guess, this kind of push towards a very kind of unapologetic take on things. And, speaking openly about some of the horrors that took place. Part of that obviously is, you touch upon intergenerational trauma as well, how it's difficult perhaps for the generation before us not to speak about these difficult memories essentially. So I think it's excellent. Obviously, we know next week, you purposely chose the 1st of November because there's going to be a lot of talking points coming out about the Sikh genocide of 84 that took place in Delhi and across other cities in India. So what do you hope to achieve by choosing poetry as the form of bringing this out? What do you hope to achieve from creative writing generally?
Yeah, actually one of the first questions I get is it a non-fiction book? And I think to a certain extent it can be considered that, just because it's based on true stories. There's nothing I wrote that was completely fictional in the sense of it didn't exist in real life or wasn't based on a true story. But I think I did have that creative license with poetry, being able to express emotion more so than fact, which I think is really important to do in our community. And I think it relates a lot more to people. When you hear the cold hard facts, it's not as impactful as hearing about one individual that struggled with tires in 1984, a woman who struggled with gender inequalities within her own family. And it's things that individuals can relate to, which I think is really important. And just touching on another thing that you mentioned there, in terms of how we're not open about speaking in our community, I think there's a couple of reasons for that I think is important to mention. So firstly, of course, there's a suppression of opinions within India itself. But then out here in Canada, at least, what I've seen is that we're very enclosed in our own communities, in the sense that we're also scared to discuss it outside of our communities. In Sikhi, we're taught not to convert people and to really push our faith on other people. And I think we fear that boundary of what is educating and what is forcing your opinion on other people. And I do think there's a safe place where you can educate people and inform them about what is happening in your community without coming off with a forceful lens.
Yeah, and that's hugely important because otherwise, our stories and our history is then picked up upon by other players, whether that's the state or those affiliated to the state and its narratives. And like I say again, what I really liked about the poems. So the poetry is divided up into 3 sections, but one thing that you can see across the board is how there isn't this kind of there's no like self-censorship. You're very much saying it as you've heard it from those who've obviously either lived through it or perhaps are recounting the experiences, or obviously what you've seen firsthand yourself during your visits and speaking to others. So that's what I really liked about this. It was, when I first read the poetry, it was just a very kind of raw, honest, and like I said, unapologetic. And I think people will really connect to that because it's very empowering. And I think for a long time, we were kind of a bit fearful, like you said, not knowing how perhaps it's going to be perceived. But I think strides have been made within that field. Do you want to share a couple of poems from the book?
Actually, I'd love to.
Who are watching.
There's one poem I really want to touch on today. It's, I think, in the second section or third section of the book here. I think it's more speaking of my experience and really what I'm trying to achieve with this book here. It's called Old Rivers Flow in Blood. The battlefield was their altar, swords pressed with honor and religion, laying tributes of their own. That red trickled down from their wayward graves, crying rivers for newborn babes. They see the descendants, praying for the forgotten dead, remembering their comrades. Those salt-filled tears create tracks in the altar, making mockery of crimson. For the slight hand of water cleans cobblestone stains, burning the long-closed stars. And I think that really encompasses what I'm really trying to do here in remembering our ancestors and our history and our families.
So what was where was that written, or was there a particular moment where you felt inspired to write that?
I think for this one, it came after I'd written this book, more closer to the end of the process, where I was taking a look at this and realizing I've written our history, which isn't something that's commonly done. But a lot of the inspiration in terms of the other poems came in the moment. I write poetry on the go. I have this one gigantic notes pad in my phone that I just write notes on, and then continuing the editing process from there. And it often covers right after people tell me stories. So I remember in India, my grandfather would sit me down and tell me, hey, this is our experience in 84. Then immediately after that, I would rush to write it down to make sure those aren't forgotten stories, right? And making sure those are written down.
Yeah. I mean, I could pick out so many poems that really resonated with me, but there was one, if I was to choose one, it's the one that's towards the end in the bonus content. I think I've spoken to you about this. Obviously, it's written in Punjabi. So most of the text, I should mention, it's obviously entirely in English, but there is some bonus content towards the end. And there are a couple of poems which Ghuntas has written in Punjabi. So there's one called Tutti Punjabi. And I think, like, again, so many of us, myself included, it was just the raw honesty of it. Like, we're always told, by our parents, our grandparents to speak Punjabi, whether at home, whether it's, just to preserve the language. And it's not always easy because, we live in westernized countries. English is a predominant language. It's everywhere on the TV, radio, in schools, in the workplace. So unless you've got that environment at home where you have, perhaps your parents or your grandparents who are consistently speaking Punjabi, it becomes very difficult. So, again, the honesty within that poem, I won't share it. I'm going to leave it for those who obviously will buy the book and read it and leave for them to kind of judge as well. But again, that honesty is, I think, so important when it comes to poetry as well, because like you said, on the one hand, you have the artistic license, you can connect emotionally, and I don't think there's a more powerful kind of way to evoke that by just being honest, upfront and honest, and you'll see actually that people will resonate with that. I also wanted to share because the book has been sent to a few people for kind of early reviews, and we have shared one via our social media so far. And I wanted to just read that out for the benefit of those who haven't seen it. In fact, I'm going to just go to. I should have this ready. Just give me a second. So this was a review that was written by Khalis Kaur, who was previously published through Khalis House, and she read the book, and Ghuntas and I were speaking about the review and how much thought went into writing the review, and I think that is a testament to the poetry, really. So Khalis Kaur, she writes, and I quote, "In a book speaking across generations, Ghuntas writes of betrayal, brutality, and beginnings anew, describing the mindset of a Panth annihilated and rebuilt. After a jarring journey back to the streets of Punjab in 1984, the reader is transported through the experiences of survivors, victims, and martyrs. Tales of escape follow alongside the heartache and romance from fresh journeys overseas. But this is more than a collection about genocide. Wisdom lies within on themes that dog the daily lives of Sikhs today: poverty and drug addiction, years of oppression, our reluctant journey towards ownership of modern history, and, my personal favourite, misogyny in a community of equals. You are challenged to face up to history's consequences as you grapple with those very issues in reality. With this, Ghuntas heralds a message of hope. The generations to follow will speak freely. In the author's own words, you can't kill fighting spirits." And like I said, it's powerful words there, and it really is testament to the way in which the poetry really resonates. And one thing that kind of sticks out to me, and that is the way she's kind of acknowledged how you speak about, or you relay the stories of the survivors, victims, and the martyrs. Because sometimes when we talk about 1984, it becomes very much focused on a particular kind of angle, and it's very rare that you'll see kind of the full spectrum of the experiences. Was that a conscious decision that you made, or again, was it kind of an organic?
It was really organic because, as I said, I was getting this information from a variety of resources, whether it be the internet, my own journey in discovering Sikhi, the Sikh student associations I was a part of at the time, where we were talking about very educational things versus stories that were very personal to my family and to a community that I was hearing one-on-one. So getting that combination really helped. But I think at the end of the day, I was always trying to single out a single experience, whether that be the martyr or the survivor, instead of taking a further glance back and looking at the community as a whole.
Right, yeah. So do you feel that there's a disconnect between the poetry and kind of Sikh writing and art forms that have emerged in the diaspora, maybe particularly within Canada or specifically in Edmonton or Toronto, and kind of the artwork that comes out through poetry in Punjab? Do you think there's a disconnect there? And if you do, maybe explaining why.
Yeah, there most definitely is. I remember when I was in the process of trying to get this book out there, I really was worried that there wouldn't be an audience for it, because I, on one hand, I'm very educated, luckily being privileged to be educated, and I'm very used to writing these like heavy text, high vocabulary systems, versus my parents aren't able to do that in the same extent, right? And I was worried, like, this is your story, you should be able to read it, and I worry that you aren't able to. But those reviews really helped me pump forward in understanding that the art is still alive. Like, we need to make sure it's alive. And I think the way that we're taught a lot of the time from Punjab, the mentality is that we don't have a scholarly system within Punjabi. If you're learning or going to higher levels of education or scholarships, you're learning in Hindi or English. And if you're moving abroad, you're learning that English is the more educated language, which isn't the case. Punjabi itself is such a complex language. And I think we have that mindset, which is really incorrect mindset. And I know I wrote this in English, but bonus content was written in Punjabi. And just keeping that in mind, so that we do have the requirement and we need to be able to keep Punjabi alive as a language. And I think I talk on that in a couple poems as well. But I really worried about that. And I think just talking about our culture, I'm worrying that we're going to be drifting towards more English content and not realizing there's still people, Punjabi artists, Sikh artists that are writing, but our own histories that need to be heard.
Yeah, I agree. I think also, aside from maybe the disconnect that exists within the language, I also think because our lived realities, although we all have this kind of connection and affiliation to Punjab and Sikhi, Darbar Sahib, and it's why 84 continues to be such a talked about kind of moment in our itihas. Obviously, those who live in Punjab, they still in many ways live under that kind of constant sense of, I don't know if threat is the right word, but they're living there, right? So they're living in Amritsar Sahib, they're living in Punjab, and the effects or the fallout of 84 and even the kind of events that led up to it, that continues to affect their daily lives. Whereas we can kind of step back and look at it, from the outside in. So although on the one hand we have this deep connection rooted in Sikhi to Punjab, we obviously live out in the West. We have our comforts. We can almost turn off from that. So I think what that then allows us to do is it gives us the kind of space to reflect and write from a different perspective. Now, that's not to say that one perspective is better than the other. It just shows you kind of, again, the variety of works that can be published. Because obviously there are some really good projects in Punjab, academically speaking now as well. There's some really good YouTube channels and really good kind of efforts happening on in terms of the grassroots of it. But sometimes there is this sense of that perhaps they are self-censoring a little bit because there is that constant threat of being thrown into jail or having their rights suspended, whatever it is. So we have that luxury, I guess, to be able to do that. And I guess it's really there is a real sense of responsibility. And it's actually one of the reasons why we started Khalis House, is to have the platform where we can be unapologetically Sikh, speak openly about these often difficult subjects. So again, really, really kind of glad that you submitted the piece, and I have no doubts that it's going to be really well received across the diaspora, and hopefully within Punjab as well. There are avenues there, right, to go into that into those spaces as well. The other question I had was, so as Sikhs, looking at our history and our itihas, we know how outspoken the Guru was about discrimination and oppression. We look at the Udasis, how Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj themselves were quite overt in their criticism, and just look at entirely at Sikhi, the Guru period. This side of like equality and justice, these are key teachings within Sikhi. Clearly there's a Sikh influence within your writings as well. You've spoken about it at the beginning. Are there any other non-Sikh sources or inspiration for your poetry?
Yeah, well, a big thing is I'm a Canadian citizen, so a large aspect comes from how I was raised as a Canadian to be very vocal in my rights and my privileges, which I think is not a luxury provided to a lot of people living in India. I think that went a large way into being able to say what I was able to say. I remember with this whole, even the recent scenarios that are happening in India and Canada currently, I remember someone came to me and was like, are you too worried that you're going to be banned in India for this poem and speaking so vocally against the government or whatever it may be? I'm like, yeah, sure, but at the end of the day, I'm a Canadian, so I have that privilege to be able to have that platform and still be safe in my beliefs. And so I think that was a large way going to getting that perspective. I think another aspect of it is I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a granddaughter. I think that comes a big play. And I think a lot of people can relate to that, even if they're not Sikh, because there's similar experiences being connected with family, connected with your community. That was a big influence in my writing.
Yeah, that's really good to hear that. You kind of, again, it's very brave on one aspect, perhaps to those who don't have that, that dard, I guess, with the bant and kind of generally oppression and discrimination that takes place. But equally, it's also, again, testament to the fact that you're not afraid to speak about these topics that sometimes are, glossed over or they're only spoken about perhaps at one period in the year or a couple of moments. But again, I think your poetry shows that actually it's continuing to affect like us outside of Punjab as well. The other question I had was about you've spoken there about being approached by people and telling you or asking you, do you feel afraid or whatever, especially given what's happening in Canada at the moment. There's a poem in the book which is titled Khalistan. I'm not going to read it because I would like the readers obviously to make up their own kind of minds about it. And I guess this relates to the previous point we made about how you've tried to depict the experiences of kind of everyone that's been affected, both from a victim perspective, but also those who were proactively, trying to further the Sikh cause. Again, what were your kind of thinkings behind it? Did you have any moments where you thought that perhaps you should sway away from this, or did you feel actually, this is exactly the right thing to be doing?
Oh, definitely. Even in writing that poem, I initially had named it Zindabad to be a more subtle nod towards Palestine, so I wasn't so vocal about it. But then afterwards, I was like, I want people to understand I am talking what my intention was in speaking about this. So I renamed it Khalistan to be sure that people understood that that was my meaning. And I have very vocal opinions in terms of generally Sikh community talks. And I think it's important to be vocal. Otherwise, you're going to be swayed by things like the government, these large groups that are existing. It's important to speak your truth as an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, it also comes across really genuine from like the non-Sikh perspective, because otherwise when you hear like different narratives and you're not empowering or just like when you don't know what your Siddhantic position is, what your principle stand is, you can be, like I said, be swayed very easily, but from the outlooker, from the person looking in, they don't quite know. Like, for example, you mentioned the Palestine conflict. It's very clear, somebody who perhaps doesn't understand, at least I know what the Palestinian position is, even though I have no kind of direct affiliation with it. And I think that that shows how genuine also the bigger kind of struggle is for them. Moving on to kind of your interest in like books generally and literature. Do you have a favorite book or something which you first read, which kind of resonated really well and sparked something where you thought, okay, I would like to write my own poetry for, based on my own identity and history and my people's, whether that was in Punjabi or English. And do you think that we as a community read enough in this present day?
I don't think we do. I'll talk first about like our community and then specific poems.
Yeah.
I think I was having a conversation, this Sikh student association that exists at University of Toronto, which is the university I attend. And we were having a conversation about how little Sikhs there were in such a high-level university. I think maybe at university I've seen 100 Sikhs out of thousands and thousands, right? Which is really unfortunate for our community, and I think we need to encourage more higher level of education. And we were getting back to this conversation of the sword versus the pen, which is, I think, a really recurring theme in Sikhi. And we were having this conversation of, we have been privileged in our community to be in such a high position of education. And so if it ever comes down to it, having the sword versus the pen in your hand, we should be in the position of picking up the pen because we have the ability to do so, while so many people in our community don't. And so I think it's a really big thing in our community to not be averse to higher education or reading or whatever it may be. And we need to encourage that more as a community for both English and Punjabi. And in terms of books, I have so many. I'm such a big reader, and so I think I read over 100 books a year, and so it's quite a bit. In terms of specific influences, I remember I read History of the Sikhs by Kushwant Singh when I was first starting up my exploration into Sikhi. And I think I know there's a lot of bias towards the book, and some people don't like it, but I think from a person who wasn't so ingrained in Sikhi from a young age, it really showed like a factual lens to Sikhi. Because I think oftentimes when you talk to people in our community about Sikhi, they have this kind of idealistic lens of the gurus were these great people, and they were, but at the end of the day, they were human, right? They were humans walking on this earth that were just learning lessons as we were. And I think he really conveyed that message well, in that these people, some people did certain things, some people did others, they made mistakes, they made great lessons. I think that was really crucial in my journey.
That's amazing. I think, it's really important. I think that we need to be reading more, and I think this relates. Actually, I think it is related to our collective experiences as a peoples. Moving out of Punjab, the fact that the displacement, the genocide that we've endured, the kind of the intergenerational trauma that comes with that, and again, because our generation, perhaps even the generation before us, there was more time to it's not as if we haven't been a very rich or kind of a community that hasn't read in the past. We've had some prolific scholars in our history, but there was this period between especially after the 80s where that wasn't really an option for many people. So again, it kind of emphasizes the importance of not just reading, but also then expressing that in written form as well. Because then again, so many conversations can emerge from that. And just going back to Kushwan saying, just speaking openly, I think you're right about the facts. I think it's very clear that it's especially for somebody who's kind of trained within the Western academic world, it's a very kind of easy read. But there are problems within the narratives that emerge about.
I think it's a good
80s,
intro into
even
Sikh.
before that, right? So I guess it shows. I guess what it highlights for me is that Sikh Itihas and history it's not really black and white. There are so many kind of underlying narratives that emerge. But one thing that you do see from my own experience and from what I've read is there is a shift that takes place after the colonial exploits, and that's clear across the board, because when we're reading about the gurus and the history that was written by the Sikhs predominantly, so before the British arrived, there's a very specific picture that's painted, and then after that it then changes. So again, I think part of this, again, part of kind of Khalis House and publishing, and kind of encouraging authors to write, is to be able to kind of almost, I don't want to say create a renaissance, but kind of reignite that passion that we have for writing. And that can only come from one, when you've read yourself and when you've had discussions and maybe even lively debates with other individuals. But it has to come from an informed perspective, I think. Again, going back to your book, I think it's quite open to interpretation as well, even though there are some very kind of fundamental themes that you're discussing. But the way it's been written, I can't give it enough high praise. I think there's something in this book for every reader. And that's what you'd hope for from a poetry book. So I'm really looking forward to how it's going to be received when it is out on the 1st of November. And just on that point, you can purchase it from khalishouse.com. It's also going to be available from the 1st of November across various Amazon markets. So Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, Amazon.co.uk, all the usual kind of sites. So you can purchase the book from those places. Ghuntas, coming towards the kind of end of this episode, can I ask firstly, what you hope to achieve with the book, and secondly, where you see yourself in, let's say, 5 years' time?
Yeah, with the book, I hope to achieve, at the very most, discussion. I think that's the number one thing. I'm sure there will be people who read it and are confused or unsure about the perspectives that are being delivered, but then they encourage themselves to further pursue the knowledge and educate themselves on these topics. And then also just making sure that people resonate with the book, right? These are stories at the end of the day that are individuals in our community. So making sure that they're being heard and you're able to resonate with the communities. And I think even the review did a really great job of that. And she really resonated with misogyny in a community of inequality, right? And I think those are topics that really can resonate with people who are just working their day-to-day lives. And as for myself, in 5 years, hopefully, cross your fingers, I'm able to continue these author pursuits. And hopefully, I have a couple projects in the works, but hopefully in the future, we will have more writing, more things of similar topics coming out.
Amazing. And I was actually going to ask generally what readers can expect after this book. But you've kind of alluded to that already, that you're working. There are some things in the pipeline. Finally, then, any kind of last sneak previews about the book? Again, for the benefit of those who are watching this for the first time or listening for the first time. Anything you'd like to share in as final words?
I think versus presenting an individual poem, I'm just going to say that there is something for everyone in here. This is spanning generations, from my grandparents to my parents to myself. So if you're at any age, any community, any race, any gender, there's something for you to be found in this book.
Amazing. And you are on social media as well. We'll share the link. So for those who are watching or listening, once you've purchased the book and you've read it, do get in touch with us as a publisher. Get in touch with Ghuntas, share your, because like you said, I think it's beautiful to say that one of the things you'd like out of it is discussion. And that would be amazing to see. So yeah, great. I think thank you very much, Ghuntas, for taking the time out. I know there is a time difference, so it's obviously quite early in the day for you. So thank you once again for taking the time out, joining me. and I'm sure we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah,
and I just want to mention one last thing. For people that are located in Edmonton, I am hopefully going to be having a book launch on November 11th. And so if you're in Edmonton and wanting to attend said book launch, there'll be books for sale, a couple of readings, and just talking about the poem in general. Reach out to me through my socials and we'll get in touch and make it happen.
Amazing. We'll be sharing the post for that as well. So you can watch this space in terms of Khalis House. We'll be sharing and supporting Ghuntas in the book launch in Edmonton as well. Okay, well, thank you very much and have a good day.
Thanks for having me.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa.
Waheguru Ji Ki
Waheguru Ji Ki
Fateh.
Fateh.